Capitol Report is a production of Senate Media Services.
His second term will be his last. Governor Tim Pawlenty details the work he has yet to do in this week's Capitol Report. Hello, everybody, and welcome to this week's Capitol Report. I'm Julie Bartkey. No state tax increases, no special session, no government shutdown. This was Governor Tim Pawlenty's mantra for the 2009 legislative session, and it held true, but not without controversy and criticism from DFL leaders. The governor refused to sign the tax bills that were sent to his desk, which increased revenue by roughly $1 billion. Instead, he decided to line item veto and unallot his way to a balanced budget. Here to talk about what's next in a variety of areas, we have Governor Tim Pawlenty. Thanks so much for joining us today.
Delighted to be with you. Thanks for having me.
You know, when you said that you weren't going to seek a third term as governor, you said that your focus now is going to be on the next 19 months. So what's your plan?
Well, people think, well, he's not going to run again, therefore he's just going to coast to the finish line. But we have a lot of work to do. As people I'm sure know, we're facing a budget deficit. 19 months is still about 25% of my term, this particular term. And so we want to finish strong, and we're not going to just quit. And we've got another legislative session to get ready for. So we're actively working on policy proposals, budget reduction proposals, and I'm going to finish strong all the way to the end.
In fact, let's talk a little bit about that budget and the unallotment that you now are tasked with. Now, you've already indicated that potential areas of cuts include LGA, higher ed, and let's go a little bit deeper now, knowing that these cuts can't even take effect until no sooner than July 1st. Have you figured out where you want to cut yet, and specific amounts, and will this be incremental or will it be kind of piecemeal?
Sure. Well, we're working on that. There's a procedure we have to follow and a sequence of events we have to follow, starting with the Commissioner of Finance declaring the circumstances exist to allow unallotment.
Which
that's occurred.
Mm-hmm.
So now we're working on the plans around unallotment. We'll probably announce those in a week or two. And the categories are going to be those categories that the federal government will allow us to impact. And in the end, what we're going to be saying to the people of Minnesota is we think in these economic times it's reasonable for your state government, our state government, to live on 96 or 97% of the revenues that it's living on currently. Most other families, most other small businesses, most other enterprises in our state are doing that, having to tighten their belts and live on a little less for a little while. We're going to ask state government to do the same. Now, when you get into the individual programs, of course, it gets more difficult, but that's basically our goal, to slow down, reduce state spending by about that amount. And I think most Minnesotans are saying, of course, it's the worst economic recession since World War II. The state's going to have to tighten its belt. In terms of areas, that's going to mean some reductions in most areas that we have. There'll be some aids to local units of government, some trimming in higher ed, some trimming in state government bureaucracy, some trimming in other areas, health and human services, welfare, publicly subsidized health care. There'll be some trimming in each of those areas and more.
So, Governor, then would your preferred choice be to phase these cuts in slowly, or do you want to have most of this $3 billion in cuts take effect almost immediately in this trimming form that
It'll be a
discussed?
mix, and so to the extent possible, we're going to try to have these be in the second year of the two-year budget cycle, so people can have fair notice about the impact that's coming up. Also, there'll be another legislative session between now and then, so if the legislature chooses to change or amend what we're doing, they'll have at least a chance to do that. But we're not going to be able to do that in every case, Julie. There's going to have to be some of these reductions made right away because of the nature of the way the money gets sent out the door and the schedule. But to the extent possible, we'll have it be in the second year.
I want to go back. When you also announced that you weren't going to seek a third term, you said that one regret that you had was perhaps the approach you took when finalizing budget negotiations with the DFL back in 2003. So now that you've chosen the unallotment route, do you perhaps see maybe regretting this down the road as well, because it could change the way future governors negotiate?
Well, I don't, in the sense that the legislature realized that there's going to be circumstances where the governor needs to do this, and they have granted this power or this opportunity or authority to the governor. So it was the legislature themselves, in conjunction with the governor, who decided this should be an option that's available to governors if you get into a crunch situation, and that's what we're in. So, this has been litigated before, and the courts at Minnesota Supreme Court have said the legislature granted the governor this authority.
Any concern about further hard feelings with the DFL leadership at this point? Is there a way to bridge that?
Well, these are difficult times, and the conflict we have with the legislature from time to time isn't personal. It's philosophical. They have a traditional kind of liberal approach to government in terms of taxes and spending and much more. I have a more conservative approach to government, which means keeping a lid on taxes and trying to contain or reduce spending. And it's not personal. My personal relations with most legislators is good, and it's civil and courteous and constructive. But we have some sharp philosophical differences. Minnesota leans pretty hard to the left. I mean, traditionally, this is one of the more liberal places in the country. To have somebody like me who's more conservative or, center-right or conservative come in and say we're going to do things differently, it's upsetting to the kind of historical, political perspective of the state and the kind of the politicians and their interest groups around the left. And so it's a new thing for Minnesota to have somebody who's more of a fiscal conservative in the governorship. It hasn't happened. Even the governors of Republican Party persuasion in modern history have been pretty much more like Democrats than, say, Republicans.
Let's go back again to the 2009 session. You have said in past news conferences you consider it a successful one from your viewpoint, having signed most of the budget bills, the spending bills. DFL leaders give you credit, and they say that you made your commissioners available probably more this past session than ever before. So they do give you credit for that. They also would argue, though, that you should have been a little more engaged in the budget negotiation process and in face-to-face interactions, and perhaps being the face at the Legislative Commission for Planning and Fiscal Policy meetings as well. Why did you choose the path that you chose, and do you consider that a successful one?
Well, first of all, they say that every year, so it's kind of a broken record. But they chose, rightly or wrongly, to use a legislative committee process to negotiate with the administration this year. I told them last year and early on this year I wasn't going to sit through as the governor as in a legislative commission for hours on end to participate in what amounts to a legislative committee process. But I designated the Commissioner of Finance, Tom Hansen, to be my spokesperson at those meetings and made all of our cabinet officials available to them. So I don't think it's appropriate to have the governor sit in a legislative commission and be part of a legislative committee process. That's a legislative role. There's an executive role for the governor, and so we invited them on a standing invitation to come and meet with me at any time, and that's how it's historically always been done and been accomplished. And they took a different approach this year. It's just different, but I don't think that their expectation that I was going to sit in legislative committee meetings as a witness and testify to them for hours on end was a well thought out strategy on their part.
And you said it's different. Would you consider it good, bad, or again, just different?
Well, the committee process had, I think, some pluses and minuses in the sense that it gave people a chance to hear and see the deliberations, but the committee that they used took no votes, made no decisions, produced no results. And so on that basis, it didn't seem to be very successful.
Now, you touched upon some of the personalities in the legislature, and you've worked with them. You've worked with them as governor for 7 years now and worked in the legislature for many years. Are there some that maybe you have a lot of respect for, even if it's a grudging respect, because the philosophies are so different?
Well, regardless of philosophy, I have respect for all public servants in Minnesota. It's a hard job. We need good people from all across the state, different backgrounds, different philosophies, to come to this place and school board gatherings and city council meetings and county board meetings and to be public servants. And it's a hard job. And so I don't ever disrespect or degrade people who are willing to serve in public office. Don't always agree with them, but I certainly always respect them.
A bit later in the program, we're going to be talking about two other bills that are designed in different ways to protect the vulnerable. One you signed, and that is the bisphenol A bill, which bans the sale of any product with that chemical in it, and it harms small children and babies. And we also have one that you vetoed, and it is the anti-bullying bill, is what it's roughly known as. So what was your philosophy behind the signing of one and the vetoing of the other?
Sure. On the so-called BPA bill, which became known as the sippy cup or baby bottle bill, there's been a dispute in the scientific community about that chemical compound and to what extent it was harmful to children. The weight of the evidence was increasingly in favor of it's harmful. So we want to err on the side of caution, and we want to protect children, particularly when it comes to things like sippy cups and baby bottles. And so I was happy to sign that bill. As it relates to the bullying bill, Minnesota has on the books currently laws that prohibit bullying. They require each school district to have an anti-bullying policy based on any reason. In addition, we have laws on the books that prohibit any sort of harassment or discrimination based on sex, on religion, on other characteristics and features. And so they passed a bill that was duplicative of those measures, in my view, and so I vetoed the bill.
And Senator Dibble would argue that it wasn't, that the current policy isn't specific enough. Reaction?
Well, I don't think that's correct. I think if you look at the policy that exists, it says you should have an anti-bullying policy that conforms with the requirements of Chapter 363, which is the Minnesota Human Rights Act. And so it goes into great detail in 363 about what's covered. And then in addition, there's a separate statute that says school districts should have a anti-bullying policy generally. And so we don't need to limit bullying to just specific categories. We want to have prohibit bullying based on everything. But I hope that Senator Dibble and others will work with me if they feel there's still a gap remaining, to identify that gap and address it comprehensively, not just the individual or certain or select groups.
Health and Human Services in general is just growing unsustainably as well, spending is. So are you looking even further down the road as you perhaps work to shift people into these different categories and different programs? Is there going to be funding to sustain those a couple of years down the road?
Well, you put your finger on it exactly right. The Health and Human Service portion of the Minnesota state budget is growing generally about 20+% a budget cycle according to the last forecast. Certain programs within that are growing even higher. The economy, as you know, is not growing at all. In fact, it's in recession, so it's growing in negative terms. It's reversing. So you can't have the economy flat or declining and have some of our programs growing 20 or 30% a budget cycle. It is irresponsible, and we can't do it. So we need health care reform holistically and comprehensively. The GAMC discussion that we had just a moment ago is one small element of that. But we need health care reform that focuses on cost containment, quality improvement, pay for outcomes, not volumes of procedures, and also hopefully maintains access to insurance. And
you have 19 months left to try to drive that message back to lawmakers and to Minnesotans. Any other messages that you want to send out to them now?
Yeah, Minnesota's got a lot of work to do. It's a great state. We lead the nation in just about everything. If not lead, we're in the top 5 or 10 in just about everything that matters. But we can't be smug about our past, because the future is here, and the world's changing very rapidly. And I worry a lot about Minnesota's competitiveness, particularly if you think about the demands for government in the form of demands for more government health care, more government transportation, more government housing, more government everything, is a function of people not being able to afford it themselves. The reason they can't afford it themselves is because in many cases, assuming they're not disabled, they lack the skill or the education to access the economy of today. The reason they lack the skill or education is, and often goes right to the issue of our schools. So we need school reform and accountability. We also need to have a very candid discussion about making sure children are brought up in environments that are stable and nurturing and engaged in terms of parents.
And how do you change the culture?
Well, we have to. I mean, one of the things we can do as governors, presidents, members of Congress, legislators, community leaders is actually talk about it. You can dramatically reduce the likelihood that somebody's going to end up in poverty if 3 things happen. They graduate from high school, they don't have children until they're 21, and they don't have children until they're in a situation where they can handle it, like being in a stable relationship, hopefully a marriage. And so the lack of a stable, involved, engaged parent in a child's life is a huge factor of the likelihood of how they're going to succeed or whether they're going to succeed. And just saying that is important, and our culture has turned away from that and is saying, we don't really focus on that anymore. We should.
Governor, you just brought it up, the P word. I'm not going to ask you if you're going to be president, if you're going to run for president, because everybody's asking that, unless you want to make an announcement right now.
I don't.
Okay.
No, and I've jokingly said in the past I'm going to be president of my Egan Youth Hockey Association.
Well, I do want to ask you, though, what kind of tools do you think the President of the United States needs to possess? What kind of characteristics? And do you think you possess the characteristics to be a commander-in-chief, if you so choose to go that direction down the road?
Well, I don't focus on that. I focus on the next 19 months as governor and what I can get done in Minnesota, and I am going to speak more broadly to issues that I think our country and our state should focus on in the future. But in terms of what any leader can do, whether you're a president, a governor, a mayor, a business leader, a community leader, you can use the power of your platform, your bully pulpit, to raise attention to issues and motivate people to try to address them or change them. So on the topic we were talking about earlier, if President Obama chose to stand up and talk about the crisis in the families in our country of children being brought up in very difficult, challenging situations, and the need to try to change behavior around that, that would be a very powerful opportunity for him. He's done some of that. He could do more of it, as we all could.
Okay. So you're not going to not make any big announcements here?
No.
I got that. So when you do leave office, what do you think your legacy will be here in Minnesota?
Well, I think in Minnesota is a state that has been, center-left for most of its modern history, and I think one of the things you can say about me is I brought some discipline around trying to bring spending back under control in Minnesota. The average increase for a 2-year budget cycle from 1960 until I became governor was 19%. We have dramatically slowed that down, and now for the first time, I think in the state's recorded history, we're actually going to reduce spending in Minnesota. That all adds up to a legacy that says this is somebody who is serious about trying to keep government spending reasonable and under control, and also reasonable on the taxpayers. We've done other great things like nation-leading reforms and improvements as it relates to veterans and members of the military, accountability in schools in terms of performance pay and school standards, moving towards consumer and markets and healthcare rather than government running everything, and much more. But I think those are some of the things that I'm most proud of.
Are those the things you hope will carry on with the next governor? And how hard will you push to get another person with the
Well, I
same
think
philosophy?
elections have consequences, and I think Minnesotans would be leery of just having the DFL run everything, because it would be a runaway train. So I think one of the reasons Republicans have done a little better on the executive side of things is because Minnesotans want a check and balance on the legislature. And if you have the whole state run by one party, you're going to have a runaway train, in my view, of the agenda of dramatically increased taxes, dramatically increased spending, less accountability in terms of government, because a big part of their party is the public employee unions, and they can only go so far in staring them down before they bite back. I can do more of that.
All right, Governor Pawlenty, thank you so much for your time today.
You're welcome. Thanks for having me.
A new law intends to snuff out a deadly problem. This news conference was to draw attention to the primary seatbelt law, with law enforcement now able to stop a vehicle if anyone in it is not buckled up. The law is now in place. Now enforcement is key.
I will feel that this is a legacy issue under our administration, and I really couldn't be more personally and professionally pleased that this legislation finally has been passed and put into effect.
Well, I wear my seatbelts all the time, but I have some members of my family that don't. I'm asking law enforcement today, pull them over, write them a ticket, because I would rather pay for my son's ticket than his funeral expenses.
Here to talk about a bill that was signed by the governor, we have Senator Sandy Rummel. Thanks for joining us today.
My pleasure.
You wrote the bill that would ban the sale of products that contain bisphenol A in them. Why did you write this? Who does it affect?
It affects consumers. It affects really the smallest of our consumers, the most vulnerable, babies between birth and age 3. And the parents, of course, who buy products for babies. So it was a consumer bill right from the beginning.
You know, I've noticed as I've been shopping for things like water bottles to take camping that a lot of retailers promote that something is BPA free. Did it take legislation to actually maybe draw the issue to light, bring it out to the forefront?
Yes, we've been working on this legislation really for at least 2 years from my perspective. And some manufacturers have already paid attention and taken the chemical out of their products. But a lot of them still don't. So a lot of products still do have bisphenol A, and they're not marked. And so the beauty of the bill is that now consumers in Minnesota will know that any baby bottle, any sippy cup, is bisphenol A free.
So your bill the law does not stop manufacturers from manufacturing things that have bisphenol A in them, but it does stop the sale in Minnesota. So who enforces? Is this something the retailers need to be watchful of, or should parents and consumers still kind of be that second set of eyes?
I think you can think of the retailer as the consumer of the products. And so because the retailers will not be able to have those products on their shelves, they will change the behavior of the people who manufacture.
So, Senator Rummel, when you wrote this legislation, were you fairly confident that it could be passed and signed as a standalone bill, or were you kind of thinking that maybe it should be a part of a larger omnibus bill?
I was confident that the bill was good for our children, good for our families. You can never be confident how a bill will fare through the whole legislative session. And I think the beauty of it is this year we had strong bipartisan support. We had huge support from parents. I think 60,000 postcards were delivered to the governor the day after the bill passed the Senate floor.
So let's talk about that support. You know, we've had you on the show before talking about the bill. As you went through this process, are you pleased with the final product, or did something have to get removed to ensure its passage?
I think what happened is we did trim the bill to be very, very specific. One, that made it more understandable both to my colleagues in the legislature, but it was very understandable to the retail stores and to the producers. It marks a beginning of paying attention to what we are putting in our products. And that's the good thing about the bill, that I think we do a great job in our state and in our country with new chemicals, but we have not done a good job on following up about the impacts of those chemicals. And so while we want to salute the innovation of our chemical industry, on the other hand, we do want to make sure that the chemical industry is paying attention to what happens to these chemicals when they reach the consumer.
So if some of these, some products that still contain BPA in them do make it to a store shelf, what is the protocol at this point? Should a consumer alert that store? Does the store alert a government agency? Do you know what the enforcement is? What's next?
I believe the consumers will alert either the store or they will alert us, and we will do some follow-up. But I think the industry is already following suit. They're paying attention. There's enough consumer push on this particular chemical that I think they will start pulling it out of all kinds of products.
And when you found out the governor did sign it, pleased, obviously?
Yes, we were very pleased. We were pleased at the bipartisan support. We were pleased at the governor's signature.
Okay, Senator Rummel, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
James Nobles was in front of the Legislative Audit Commission giving the latest on a variety of investigations. One centered on a federally mandated computer system that verifies whether a new employee can work in the United States. He clarified some issues with E-Verify.
It became an issue when, in January of 2008, Governor Pawlenty issued an executive order which required executive agencies to use E-Verify, and also required certain other businesses that are involved with state government to use it.
Now here to discuss one of the bills the governor vetoed, we have Senator Scott Dibble. Thanks for joining us
Thanks
today.
so much. Appreciate being here.
Let's talk about what's roughly known as, or has commonly become known as, the anti-bullying bill.
Right.
And in essence, you had hoped to take current law and refine it by expanding the scope of, or actually being more specific with areas of harassment and bullying in schools. Why, first of all, did you feel the need to expand on a law that currently exists?
Well, really what we did was we took what were two existing statutes that were somewhat in conflict. They were confusing, really didn't give the kind of direction to school districts and school boards that was necessary to make sure that they could find what they needed to do in one place. We do that from time to time. People have good ideas. They end up in different parts of the law. So we did what's called recodifying, making sure that things lined up and folks knew where to go. And also the law only had reference to other parts of the statute that needed to be followed as well. So rather than referring to another piece of the statute, the Human Rights Act, we simply pulled some specificity out of that and put that in the law that we proposed. The reason we did that was because the reason I just cited, administrators in school districts and the like were a little confused. What exactly were they supposed to do? And we also learned in our research that fully 80% of the school districts in the state really don't follow what is in the law. So we felt like we needed to be more specific. When you don't talk about the kinds of kids who are bullied in disproportionate numbers on the basis of national origin or on their physical characteristics, their perception of sexual orientation, it's as if there is no policy whatsoever. The experience of those kids is the same as for those kids for which there is no bullying protection in their school.
So given that, as you just said, 80% of school districts aren't even following perhaps the policy or the laws that are in place, is this more of an enforcement issue? That was an argument that was brought up by critics of this.
Well, the law also would serve as direction to the Department of Education so that they're doing the kind of proper follow-up and monitoring and checking in with the school districts to make sure they're doing what they need to do. You know, the only tool that legislators have to communicate what should be being carried out in the form of policy and practice is legislation. And so we gave fairly specific direction through the bill just to make it clear that school districts need to be enacting these policies, they need to be communicating what they are so that there's a positive benefit to kids in schools so they're not experiencing the kind of bullying, harassment, intimidation, even violence that's going on right now in our schools.
So were you surprised that the governor vetoed this?
I was extremely surprised by the governor's veto, and I'll tell you why. The governor called myself and Jim Davney into his office personally. I had to miss the meeting because I was busy with something else that morning, but we had a number of subsequent meetings as well with his liaisons. And the indication from the governor was that he wanted to sign this bill, but he wanted to find language that he was slightly more comfortable with. So we started to work very, very hard over the course of the following weeks to make sure that we could create some language that he was comfortable with, that other major stakeholder groups were comfortable with. We were told on 2 separate occasions, very explicitly received assurance that we had done everything that the governor had asked us.
So given that, what's your approach for next session? Is this something that you will revisit?
Well, I think the governor's made it clear that he won't sign anything that we pass.
So wait for a new governor then?
I would say we continue to talk about this issue. We had the support of all of these organizations, 20-plus organizations, and more came on that didn't even end up on this list. All the major education organizations, all the folks who are looking out for kids and their best interests. I think the governor probably had other motives for vetoing this bill. I think the fact that it explicitly protected kids who were perceived to have a particular sexual orientation, and he's got a certain constituency that's very, very opposed to anything that might be construed to be of benefit to gay folks, is a big reason why he vetoed it. He's moving on to bigger and better things on a national level, so he's got a constituency that he's trying to satisfy. So I don't think there's anything that he would do. He broke his word to us to sign this bill. And so I don't think we're going to be able to pass this bill in the coming year. So yeah, I think it's going to take leadership from the executive branch and not this governor.
Okay, Senator Dibble, we're out of time, but we'll obviously watch to see what happens in the coming sessions.
Great. Thank you very much.
And that's going to wrap up this week's Capitol Report from all of us here at Senate Media Services. I'm Julie Bartkey. Thanks for watching.